Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. Great to be with you as always. I've got another fantastic guest I'll introduce here in a bit. Just as a reminder, this is the part of our series where we are detangling our anxiety so that we can be more deeply connected to ourselves, to our people, even to difficult people. Sometimes our people and difficult people are the same thing, and more connected to awareness of God. You know, chronic anxiety or reactivity, it disconnects us. And what most commonly happens is it disconnects us from ourselves. We're no longer aware of what's going on in us. And one of the controversial things I teach that you might try is I found it helpful to first connect to myself before I try to connect to God. I found when I was anxious and wasn't aware of it, which is a lot of the time, I would reach out to connect to God, but because I was disconnected, you might say my disconnected self ended up connecting to God, and I found it difficult. This doesn't always work, but I have found it much more fruitful just to pause and pay attention to what's going on in me. And now, when I reach out to God, I have a lot to give to God. And isn't that the gospel, the exchange of our life for God's life, dying to myself, being resurrected in Christ? I think the good news is that's not a one-time thing. It's not like something you do in order to have eternal life. It's a daily reality. So, as we light the candle today, is there something that is disconnecting you? Or is there something that you want to give to God in exchange for God's goodness? Just as I light the candle, we can relax into God's presence together. You know, it's crazy, right? It only takes a minute or two. And also what's helpful to know, it doesn't last. I think we think of our relationship with God as this static thing. Oh, I'm relaxed into God's presence, so it's all fine now. No, I'm just trying to find moments. I'm just trying to stub my toe on the goodness of God 12 to 15 times a day. For those of you joining for the video, this candle will be on the shelf behind me during the interview with Alan, just as a simple reminder that God is with us. Many of you who follow my work, maybe you've read my latest book, The Expectation Gap, you know that I've been on a kick reading a Catholic priest named Herbert McCabe. I love the way Herbert McCabe talks about sin and the way sin pollutes and infects our capacity to see how God sees us. I wrote about this in The Expectation Gap, but just briefly, McCabe makes this provocative statement that sin doesn't change the way God views us. Sin changes the way we think God views us. So God's love for us never changes, but our view of God's love changes. And so the reason to repent is so we can relax into God's presence. Those are more my words than Herbert's. But before we get to the interview and I'll introduce the guest, I just want to read for us a quote from Herbert McCabe where he talks about sin a bit more. This is from his book, God, Christ, and Us. Here's Herbert. The root of all sin is fear. I think that all sins are failures in being realistic. Even the simple everyday sins of the flesh that seem to come from mere childish greed or pleasure have their deepest origin in anxiety about whether we really matter. The anxiety that makes us desperate for self-reassurance. To sin is always to construct an illusory self that we can admire instead of the real self that we can only love and that God loves. All right, my guest today is Alan Briggs. Alan is somebody who's had a profound impact on my life, and I'm really excited to introduce him to those of you who may not be familiar with him. Alan's a pastor and author. He currently runs an organization called Stay Forth, which is an exceptional coaching organization for leaders. They specialize in leadership coaching, vision clarity, but one of Alan's unique specialties is sabbatical coaching. And I have been personally the recipient and beneficiary of Alan's work a few years ago, actually, as I was really discerning whether to go from full-time local church ministry into what I'm doing now. Quite frankly, it was a terrifying decision. I was quite fearful. A lot of people around me, if they were on the show right now, they would say, oh man, Steve was really anxious through that time. It was a scary thing after 26 years of local church ministry to kind of jump off the cliff of this new thing. And Alan, for me personally, was a phenomenal guide And that's why I'm excited to share him with you. As you'll listen in this interview, he has such great, simple, practical ways that we can clarify our well-being, whether we need a sabbatical, how to get rest, how to be fueled by what we do. So I look forward to you joining on this interview with Alan. All right, Alan, let's start with anti-burnout. You do a lot of work with leaders, but one of your themes is helping them pay attention to, avoid, recover from burnout. What are you seeing now that we're in 2024?
Honestly, man, seeing it everywhere, seeing it in different fields, and a little bit of that, Steve, as you know, is you find what you're looking for. So as I'm looking for it, as I'm listening, I mean, long story, but I was hitchhiking in a mountain town not all that long ago. That's not normal for me. But literally, it was two people in the medical field. And they're like, we're just kind of out in Colorado and we just need a break. We don't know if we can sustain what we're doing, but we just need to be away and in nature, and life's not working very well for us. So seeing a lot around burnout and overwhelm as we record this, kind of heading back to school. And it's an interesting time as well, kind of in the micro, where we have that kind of space of July, and then August is kind of, midway through, boom, it's all on. And I feel it as well. So in micro, I think we feel that. And then obviously the division, the political climate. I actually wanted to get this book out, and I pushed it a little harder than I normally have in the past with books, to be able to get it out before the election cycle heated up. And so, of course, seeing that, I've been in the space for 5 years full time, and there was actually a decision that I made to go upstream at one point. And I thought it would have been career suicide. Who wants to talk about health, And what I realized is that as COVID revealed it, we're all a hot mess. And ultimately, we all are carrying more anxiety. As you know, we're all more overwhelmed than we think. I say this to leaders a lot. You're always more tired than you think. And so I get to do a lot of sabbatical coaching as well. And so I'm also like really encouraged at the exact same time. So I have like sort of cultural discouragement, maybe in macro, but in micro, as I work with leaders, as you do too, like I get to see incredible stories of leaders turning the ship, creating healthy cultures around them, loving their families really well. So it's a strange tension that I sort of always live in.
Yeah. Since you brought up the election, I do tend to ask most of my guests this year, what's your best piece of advice to navigate 2024 political life?
Yeah, careful little thumbs what you type.
You don't believe that one more comment from you is going to do the trick on social media?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I could tell all my friends what I believe, and suddenly they would all be with me. So I've yet to do that, but I feel like I could have that power, right?
Alan, I remember when I was in seminary, we had this old crusty pastor come visit us, and he basically said to us, he really turned the whole room off, and he's probably a decent guy. But he basically said, I'm going to tell you all my mistakes so you don't have to make any of them. And, we were young, but we weren't dumb. And we kind of fought him and said, well, we feel like we have the right to make our own, we have the right to make mistakes. That's not the way it works. Just because you tell us your mistakes, we have to learn the hard way. As it relates to burnout, I find it hard to notice when I'm on the burnout path.
Yep.
So I find that most of us kind of run into it without realizing it. What are a couple of the signs that I should be paying attention to that maybe I'm not well?
Yeah, so really well said. That I think there are people, Steve, that realize it sooner than others. So for example, my wife and I, she feels fatigue before I do, but I'm likely to just keep going. I'm more likely for a crash. So people like you and I that are very driven, doers, leaders, launch things, we tend to see it last. Other folks tend to probably not be as big of launchers or doers, or maybe going as big. Probably a past in athletics is something that I actually see as a big deal, that whole push through it, often for males, but not always. So I think first of all, that self-awareness to know, like, which type of person am I? If I were just to simplify in two buckets, my wife's going to feel it earlier and actually is way more self-aware, and that's way healthier than for me. And then some of the questions even that we may get into of, when am I not me? When am I just kind of negative and grumpy? I'm generally an optimistic person and hope-filled. And I start to grasp for certain things. Like for me, it's space. When I feel like my life is boxed in very, very tightly, even though I did it to myself, I start to resent people that I'm in relationship with. I may have even scheduled with them. It doesn't make sense at all. And so whenever I get into those kind of moments, I know that it's so against the grain of who I am. What's going on with me right now? And those are often the times where you need more than just an incredible restorative Sabbath or a good vacation, but actually like a mindset shift.
Yeah, I really like that question. When am I not me? I'm reflecting on it for myself. I think I tend to be wildly optimistic, sometimes maybe even dangerously optimistic. And when I go into doom or overwhelm or kind of a sense of foreboding, that's a great, I really appreciate that, Alan. That's a great sign for me. Like, oh, I need to pay attention to something. The challenge with burnout, it's one of those words that's actually, I think, a lot like the word anxiety.
Yep.
I feel like that word burnout covers too much ground.
Yeah.
Is
Way
there a
overused.
simple definition of it, or how do you define it?
Yeah, I do a lot of defining work early in the book, but I think kind of the clinical and the relational definition, Steve, I thought were the best. Is I just listened to friends who have burned out, and some of them said ice skating uphill, completely not caring that I don't care anymore. Like those kind of definitions, readers have said are actually more helpful. But the clinical definition that just floors me every time is voluntary self-exploitation. Voluntary self-exploitation. And that to me is like, oh man, it's not a boss standing over us saying, why can't you work 100 hours a week? Why don't you answer 3 hours of email every night before bed? It's us doing it to ourselves, ironically, even though we're probably hating it at the time. And so voluntarily exploiting ourselves and sort of stealing away our own sense of freedom and joy in life, like the things that we most want to replenish and actually most deep down, I think, do want to do, we end up avoiding when we're in that burnout cycle or on that slippery slope, which is so ironic. The very things we need, we're actually going to avoid. And so it doesn't even make sense rationally is one of the hardest things about burnout. And we're usually the last people to notice, which is also extremely unkind, I think, of burnout, that we'd be the last ones to see it.
I have a dear friend, Dr. Wes Beavus. He's a clinical psychologist, fellow Aussie. You know, the world needs more Aussies, Alan. I think we all agree on this.
That's right, man. Wes is a good man. I actually quote his work in the book.
Yeah. And, you know, he did his doctorate in burnout, particularly specifically ministry burnout. And his thesis is that it is a bit like a train and there's several steps along the way. But when you're toward the end of the burnout ride, it's very hard to jump off the train, all that momentum. What's your reaction to that?
Absolutely true. I want to go upstream. So Desmond Tutu talked about, if all of the bodies are falling in the river, we have to go upstream and see how these bodies are falling in the river. And so I actually don't coach leaders who are officially and even medically, somebody would say, are burned out. There are retreat centers, and I'm so grateful for people with letters after their name. I want to be more in the kind of health club than the hospital sense of that, to say, how do we go upstream and say, Steve, you're in a good space right now. Great. How do we stay in a good space right now? What does that look like for you? And so I end up doing a lot of scheduling work and things like that that feel mundane, but that go, man, how did you get in this zone that you're in that's pretty solid right now? How do you stay in that? And of course, there are things in life we can't control. Some of those actually happened to me last summer. Ironically, a year ago today, I was pretty tired from a lot of things we couldn't control. Work was going great, though. Work was even the place that I felt like was most stable and life-giving. A lot of family challenges, a lot of challenges with my wife and her career, things in our home. We literally had a flood and construction. And so none of it was quote unquote my fault, but it was all my responsibility. And that was extremely challenging. So we got to go upstream. We've got to go in times that kind of peacetime and not wartime to go, how do I continue to stay in this zone? And I use the word design a lot. So much is, how am I designed? And so somebody else living your life, Steve, would do a terrible job at it, hopping on planes and impacting teams. but you're loving it. You're designed well for it. And so a lot of it is actually doing design work first. And then I ask this question a lot from James K. Smith: what is the good life for you and for your family? And if you could figure out that good and that true and that beautiful life for you, stop comparing to other people, we see some pretty incredible results, because a lot of those things kind of naturally show up once you know the answers to those couple questions.
Yeah, so this idea of the good life, I think for some people, when they hear that, they're like, oh, I know right away. And then other people, maybe they've not given themselves permission to think about it. How long does it take to start to answer that question?
In my experience, it's usually a couple months. It's not a couple years. It's a couple months, but it takes somebody asking the question. The question usually floors people at first, and then they start to uncover different aspects of it. And a lot about coaching, Steve, is permission. And you probably do a lot of this as well. It's just permission to even think about this. This is not selfish to think about. In fact, it could be very selfish for you to never think about it and for you to continue burning out, and everybody around you is impacted by that. So what is the good life for you here? And think about generosity, and think about your time, and think about vacation, and think about work in your zone. I love the Working Genius assessment. And that's been huge from the team, Pat Lencioni and his team, because it's like, man, here are my drains, here are my fills. Like you talk about, the life-giving list is really important to us, those little things. And I can see, here's my red zone here, my frustrations, and here are my geniuses. And what if I could just move 10, 15, 20% more of my work week from one to the other, like literally transformative, because then I go home filled up versus going home with a deficit, trying for my family to fill me back up, when instead I need to be going home, filling up my kids and encouraging them, challenging, serving at home, as opposed to, man, I'm just trying to get back up to zero so I can get some sleep and get back to work.
Yeah, I still work with leaders that when we talk about, the good life, or what does it mean for you to be well, even sometimes we get really simple, like Jesus' question, what do you want, right? And I do find some leaders push back and say, well, if I live the good life or be well, I end up like, to exaggerate it, Alan, I end up in God's hot tub. The world is burning, but there I am just lazy. I don't think that's not been your experience, though.
No, not at all. It actually ends up doing the opposite. Then the difference that I've noticed, Steve, is resentment goes down. Like, we don't talk about resentment enough. When we serve and we overcommit, we end up resenting the very people that we committed to serve. And so that's something, if you're listening, if you're watching, and you are a servant of any kind, you literally serve for a living, heads up for resentment. And when that shows up, that's probably a sign that we have actually overcommitted, thrust something on somebody else that actually wasn't theirs to begin with. So I end up doing a lot of that as thinking, like, where's that little nerve or that tip of the iceberg? Then we go backwards and think, oh, maybe you resent that person you're coaching because you actually want what they have and don't feel permission to seize it yourself. Speaking for a friend, of course.
Yes, of course. All right, Alan, you've been kind enough to join us in a part of the podcast where we're really helping our audience pay attention to their false needs. This is obviously a driving theme on my work, and the question that we're throwing to our audience and then to my guests, what do you think you need that you don't really need? In my case, I usually there's 30 to 50 things at any given time. If I take inventory of my life, I probably have 30 to 50 false needs that some of them take years to uncover. But if you were to get started, what comes to mind for you of something you think you need that you don't actually need?
Yeah, that the first one is affirmation, that, just being liked. And I literally was thinking about this a couple of days ago. Is there somebody that we just see business and leadership in a completely different way? It's a big deal in our city and in our town. We just are going to be like sandpaper. He doesn't like the way I do things. I don't fully understand him, but I wouldn't say I have anything against him. But it bugs me. It drives me crazy that he doesn't fully approve of the way that I do things. Integrity is a big deal to me, but I think at the heart of it, it's like, Alan, you don't deserve for everybody to like you. That's not necessary for you to do the work that God has given you to do. So that's the first one. The second is control, but it's a strange form of it for me because I like to control my time and energy well enough that I have that escape over here as well. So Enneagram 7, guilty as charged. And so sort of organizing my life, if I can control these things, the lie is, then I can have enough space over here to escape to these other things. And so other people's demands don't reach me. And so it's a strange mix between control and escape. It's a kind of a weird cocktail.
No, that makes sense to me. Like, so your two, we have the big 5 sources of anxiety for every human, which is control, perfection, knowing the answer, being there for others, and people pleasing. So you've listed number 1 and number 5, control and people pleasing. Let's start with control first, because as an Enneagram 7, like I have been in relationship with 7s where their yes, and these would be an unhealthy 7, where their yes does not mean it's a yes. Hey, are you available Wednesday night? They say yes. What they really mean is, until a better offer comes along. And back in my early years, I remember being the victim of that, where I'm like, wait, it's no longer a yes. Wait, what happened? So when you're talking about control, it makes sense to me that as a 7, you're always wanting to make sure there's an opportunity that you don't miss. Is that resonating with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I like an escape hatch, I think is a good way that I describe that. My daughter, who is actually an adult now, she's a 7 as well. So I could see it more in her, right? It's easier to see in other people. But this is where family of origin comes against a lot of times your motivation, where in my family of origin growing up, it was your word is your word. Your yes is your yes. When you commit to something, and even like our Briggs family motto is we do stuff. And so it's like we do the stuff we commit to. And so I can feel my integrity and even family of origin butting up against naturally when I go, man, I really need to make the commitment now. And it's like if you said, hey, can we hang Wednesday night? I'm going to need time to think about that and look at it, because once I commit, I'm showing up. And so people have said, you don't present like a 7. They get to know me in this season of life, and I'm not that. I have lots of demands, lots of limits, these 4 beautiful limitations called children on my life. And with that, like I was saying before we started recording, I can feel kind of really squeezed. And like this time of the year really tightens up. Summer, blue skies, open, schedules are as big as they need to be. And then this shrinking of that. And just to name that feels like a loss to me for a couple of weeks has been really healthy. My wife gets excited when the kids go back to school, and I feel like my world has just gotten a little bit smaller. And this is just going to require more steadiness and faithfulness right now. So it has been hugely helpful to have the Enneagram, to name that, and also to just talk with my wife about that. Like, she feels something completely different when school starts than I feel. And that's okay. And that may not change, but it gets a little bit easier, I think, each year, Steve.
Well, and it makes sense, you were sharing about just the nature of being a parent where kids come home and they want to sign up for opportunities. What's fascinating to me about our false needs is the way they approach us as a threat. We can't say, like, it doesn't feel like a threat in the moment. It takes a while to realize, oh, the reason I'm reacting this way is because I feel suddenly something precious is threatened.
Yep.
It makes total sense to me, Alan, listening to you, that your sense of control is deeply threatened when a kid says, I want to sign up for this thing, because now you're figuring out, is that threatening this escape hatch?
Literally, that's 50 car rides, which equals a certain amount of time, which equals saying no to things. And so it absolutely is my brain doing a threat assessment in that moment.
Yeah. All right, let's tackle people pleasing. This is such a common one for people. So many can relate. What's the positive side of people pleasing? Every source of anxiety has a gift, has a good contribution. What are you good at that the shadow side is that you're a people pleaser?
Side note on people pleasing. It's so funny. Like, everybody in ministry that I talk to is like, I'm recovering people pleaser. And I'm like, good, you're not a jerk. Like, thank you. So I think a lot of times that's gotten a bad rap. It's like, yes, you love people and want to serve them. But for me specifically, I think that, that word over functioning, I can over care. People love to visit in Colorado, as you know, Steve. And when people come to visit and they'll text you like, hey man, what are you doing? And it's like, it's a Tuesday. Like, I'm working. Like, what do you think I'm doing? But they'll be like, oh man, but I really wanted to go fishing. Well, and you gave me 10 minutes notice. So I really wanted to go see this. Any chance you could be available? And I have these commitments and I feel like, oh man, can I drop that to show them a great time, to host them well, to be generous, to make sure their vacation is awesome. And so that good side of, I want to host people well. Like I want to take something very normal, like a Tuesday, and turn it into something epic, because I could take them on an adventure that they would be telling stories about later. And I love that about myself. And that's incredibly challenging as well, because it would be easy to say, oh, let me step out of the normal, mundane coaching today, serving people, try to get my rides covered for my kids. And then I could take them up to the mountains to do something epic. And that's obviously not reasonable or realistic most times.
Yeah. This leader in town where you don't see eye to eye and you end up in his brain by the sound of it. Mm-hmm. What do you do when you notice you're ruminating too much on what someone thinks of you?
I've had to ask the question, what if nothing changes? And often we are so optimistic and hopeful, and you're talking about that for yourself, that actually plays against us of no, certainly enough time together, they'll understand me and my heart and my desires and motivations, certainly enough time and they'll just get me. And it actually, I have a story connected to it from college, but I'm like, what if things don't change? And it was the test that I failed that was a lot of the grade, that the college professor, I thought, if I go show, this is so embarrassing to admit, I'm a good guy. If I actually go into his office and have a conversation and I'm you don't understand. I really had a great intention of doing well. I just literally slept through when I was going to study. This was easy. You should give me a retest. I literally thought he would see he's a good guy and I'll do that. And he's like, nope, sorry, can't do that. Well, what if I fail this? Well, then you'll retake it. And I remember failing a college course and having to tell my parents that, and then going, what if nothing changes in his mind? I will literally fail the class and I will have to call my parents and I will have to, and so that's been actually really helpful to go, what if nothing changes? And we just kind of have a different way we see the world. And then it's and I'll be okay. So that helps me separate from his brain in that moment.
That's so good, Alan. We're inching our way to the gauntlet, and I know that you probably this morning
I'm shaking,
had a weeping
in my boots. I woke up if I see Steve's face, it's going to mean the gauntlet is near. So
yeah. And I apologize too for the weeping spell, all of it.
Yeah.
But before we do, you and your brother and your dad had this amazing tradition. I love hearing stories of people experiencing things that I've never heard of before. Tell us about your visits to towns.
So 13 years running, we go to we say B-rated city, mid-major city, so not world-class like in New York, San Francisco, Chicago. And kind of, honestly, we fill the gap in what we don't know about the city. So what's going on in Boise? What's going on in Sacramento? And this was just Providence, Rhode Island. I don't know. And so none of us have spent time in that city. And we literally enter a city only based on food recommendations that other people give us. I met a gal on a plane and we literally talked for about 2 hours on the way there about her music career. And then she's from Providence. So she tells us all these restaurants, the best food in the city. You got to go to this place and tell her I sent you. And so it is honestly, it's urban exploring for a few days. And it's awesome to be with my brother and dad. But one of the things, Steve, that I hear leaders say all the time is everyone needs me all the time. And my dad's still leading kind of at the height of his career. My brother and I, raising kids, all that. We just say for 3.5 days, this is a space where nobody needs anything from me. And 3 of us are just 3 anonymous dudes exploring a city just because we can. It's just all delight, no duty. And so that I think is what's been behind it. We tripped into it. This wasn't like our brilliant scheme. And every year we just look forward to it. So it's a bit of a rite of passage of heading into the fall and ending the summer. But we have so much fun together.
It's been so fun to follow it. I follow it on social media. You guys often post photos about it. What was your most recent city you guys visited?
Yeah, so Providence, Rhode Island was this year, and it's the kind of thing like, man, what's in Rhode Island? Is that actually even a state? And the beautiful thing is you plan just enough, it's like chaotic idea. You plan just enough the order side, and then there's so much chaos to go, hey, let's just stop in this breakfast joint. Let's stop in this coffee shop. Let's see if we can get kayaking, get out on the water. Oh, look, there's scooters here. Let's hop on it. And so, you find what you're looking for in that. And we have found some of the kindest people. People want to show us a good time. Whenever we tell them that, they're like, that's awesome. Let me tell you about this. And they'll nominate other cities for it as well. And so I would say if you want to talk about anti-anxiety for a few days, I think that's it right there, because it's this safe space. We already know each other. We don't have anything to prove, nothing to lose. And other than just a few pictures, nobody else really knows kind of what we experienced those few days. And our wives love it. It is an absolute blast. And we always get creative ideas as well, because you're in that liminal space and just the fresh ideas are firing and inspiring.
So good. All right, Alan. Well, I'm sorry to say the time has come. You have faithfully served in the local church your whole adult life. You've been part of church planting movements in Colorado and around the world. You have coached so many leaders to clarify their vision, to figure out who they are, God's unique contribution. You have hiked a charcuterie board up a mountain. You have jumped into swimming pools with your brother as a fully grown adult, and yet you have not yet successfully navigated the being human gauntlet of anxiety. So let's begin. I think we'll do 5 questions for you here. Tell us about a behavior in others that you judge.
When other people pinch pennies, especially as it relates to somebody else losing out on those pennies, it drives me crazy. It feels like anti-generosity to me.
Give us an example of what that looks like. What's a case there?
So I run a co-working space as part of what I do. And when somebody wants to figure out every single possible way that they could get a free membership, or every single possible way that they could use the best of what we've put together for thousands of dollars, and how to not have to pay, that would be an example. If somebody is figuring out, how do I get a discount from this person? It's a direct service that feeds that person's family, like you and I know very well, Steve. I see the other side of that, and to say they actually need that money to go on a vacation. They actually need that money to put their kids in dance. That absolutely drives me crazy. What's interesting is it's not from a corporation. It's not about being thrifty. It's not if they can save, $10 on their cell phone bill every month. So it's actually not about thriftiness. It's actually about those pennies coming out of Steve's bank account or somebody else's. Just drives me nuts.
Yeah, it's the unnecessary squeeze. That's what's ticking you off. It's like, you don't need to squeeze this person. You've got it, but you're just being okay, that's really helpful, Alan. Thank you. I was recently with a dear friend of mine, Matt Carlson, and he was sitting down. He told us about, I was at this party. I'm sitting down with a teenager I don't know. And he says, the teenager looks at me, Matt's our age, and the teenager says, Mr. Carlson, what's one of your favorite things about yourself? And so I said to Matt, I'm grabbing that for the gauntlet. So Alan, you're my first guest to ask this fresh question. What is one of your favorite things about yourself?
I love that I can take a very normal day and turn it into an adventure. That food or an experience or an idea, and I don't have to be in an epic place like we live in Colorado, that I know how to make adventures. And whether that's with my kids, or I went off to the park the other night, or whether that's with a friend, who's in town, or whether that's somebody who says, hey, well, what if we did this? I know in my brain how to turn a normal day into surprise and delight.
I love that. So good.
Oh, which by the way,
what is one way?
It's against the gauntlet. I want to apologize, but I was thinking about you and I did some work together. We spent a day in Golden together, And my
Yep.
favorite part, I mean, you had some cool breakthroughs and ideas and aha moments that got me excited, but we're just out on a stream afterwards. Brains were just done, mush. But that's what I remember. And I believe that I caught 0 trout and you held up this teeny little trout. But to me, that was the most memorable part of the day, is actually going up Golden Canyon and getting in the stream together and sort of celebrating the day. So I was just even thinking about that. This is a fairly normal day of us sort of doing our work. But then, man,
Yeah.
seeing you hold up that 2-inch brook trout just changed my life.
Oh, I love that you mentioned that. It's so funny. I was actually thinking about when you and I fished together. I was just thinking about it leading up to this interview. And it's funny that you remember the fishing, because I asked you to help me clarify what I do now. When I met with you, I was a lead pastor, discerning, is God calling me onto what is this exciting and terrifying unknown? And you were instrumental. It's the whole Capable Life membership experience that I run. You helped give birth to it. So it's funny to me that you remember a 3-inch trout. While we're talking about trout, I think what happened, I think a mother trout gave birth to a trout. And then 1 minute later, I caught the baby.
You did. But you released it. You were very kind. But you did hold it up to let me know that you did beat me in the trout race. So there's still that competition we had, even at the end of a good day together.
That's funny. I remember it exactly that same way. Oh, that's so good. Okay. 2 dynamics that infect every relationship: assumptions and reactivity. The fastest way to devolve a relationship is live out of assumption, live out of reactivity. Tell us about an assumption that you've had about someone that was wildly off.
This person is against me, as opposed to what was actually true was this person is for me, but this person is afraid. There is like an afraid, I can still see it, this like afraid look on their face, which I thought meant that I threatened this person. But they had their own fears. And like, when you can just kind of see like somebody's afraid underneath the surface, I had mistaken that. And it was their own thing, their own story, their own issue. It wasn't mine. But I assume certainly that this person isn't for me. And then you find out later through notes or them introducing them to friends who, rave about this person, they love you, that actually wasn't true at all. Also myself, like I used to think that people thought I was chill or relaxed. And I remember somebody going, "Oh no, you're not relaxed, Alan. You're intense." And I had to deal with that because I'm like, what I wanted to see and what I actually saw were just 2 different things. And they said, "It's okay. We know that you love us and care for us. We like your intensity, but you're not relaxed." And that was a turning point for me. Actually, it was like my self-assumption right there changed actually kind of how I was mirroring out to the world.
So good. All right, 2 more questions. Where do you experience a gap between what you believe about God and what you actually experience from God?
God desires rest for us, like even the scriptures around rest. And yet it is hard for my brain to take a rest. Less for the body. I can be relaxing in a hammock and think, I need to be learning more. I need to be reading more. I feel like God has stretched me and the opportunities well beyond what I'm educated for and prepared for many times. And so I'm kind of always feeling like I'm operating from a gap. And I've actually had to deal with that God is a God of rest. And yet maybe the hardest thing for me on Sabbath is to not pick up an engaging book, even though it's easy for me to rest in my body, rest with my family, to think I'm working from this deficit. And so mental rest is the gap for me.
Okay. And then the final question that I ask every guest: when in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
It's always when somebody is fully present with me. And I'll just use a simple one. My wife and I do this 1-mile loop almost every night. And when she's tired and is like, "Oh, I don't know," but she rallies and we take this, it's like 20 minutes. This walk to just talk about our days, not because we have to talk about anything, but just to be together and soak it in. I don't know that there's anything finer for me in life than that.
Hmm. My guest has been Alan Briggs. Alan's most recent book, Alan's written a number of books, but his most recent book is AntiBurnout, A Lighter Way to Live and Lead in a Heavy World. He's the founder of Stay Forth. As I shared in the introduction, for those of you who don't know Alan, he's had a profound impact on my life. His ability to help people clarify their vision, and not just the vision and what God's wired them to do, but what I've appreciated about Alan is how much detail he puts in the execution of it, right? So a lot of people can get you excited, but Alan's gift is also saying, hey, here is how you could deliver that to the world. And so for those of my audience who are very familiar with my work and Capable Life and all that has come out of that, a lot of that was birthed in Golden, Colorado, sitting down with Alan. And so I'll have links in the show notes to Alan's book, to Stay Forth. I don't think there's another guide that I have sent as many people to as I have to Alan Briggs. Alan, thanks so much for coming on Being Human.
Steve, you're a gem. You're doing incredible work, but you're a better man even than that. So respect you a ton. Thanks so much for having these uncomfortable conversations. And frankly, I'm relieved to be on the other side of the gauntlet. So I feel like today was a big moment in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, the nap is imminent and understood. All right.